Welcome to our first Cars and Conversations with Paul Wilson. He's going to introduce to us his 1913 Regal Underslung. Thanks, Paul. Take it away.
Okay, I bought this car in a great tumult of different emotions. I saw it at Hershey in a dealer's tent, and I went to Hershey, and this was Saturday. And Hershey starts on a Thursday, and by Saturday, the car had been looked over by all of the most expert old car people in the whole country, and it was still unsold. And it was expensive. And I thought logically, if all these people, the cream of the crop, have looked at it and passed on it, it's too expensive. So I looked and I looked, and I decided it just was too much. And then I went off and I was heading to dinner, and I saw a friend, and I said, I just have to get this car because it's a rare situation where it's completely unrepeatable. If you're buying an old Jag or a Porsche or something, if you wait long enough, you can get another one just like that, and maybe better, and so you can pick and choose. But there are some situations where you don't have a choice. And as I digested my information, I realized with this car, I didn't have a choice. There were two things about it that I never, ever was going to be able to match again. And the two things are, it's absolute perfect aesthetics. It is the most beautiful car of its whole era. And long ago, I wrote a history of American car styling. I can give you a whole discourse on the changes from 1912 to 1913 of how these cars were designed and everything. I've seen them all. And this one is just at the top of the pile. It is the masterpiece, in my opinion. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, it's 111 years old, and it has the original leather in good condition, the original top, the original nickel plating, the original wheels, a lot of the original paint. It is a low mileage car that has never been modified, and to have a car more than a century old and have it so completely preserved as this one, I thought this is never going to happen again. So I took a deep breath and I wrote a check for the car. And I was thinking, boy, that was a lot of money. But still, think of the things that it does so well. Well, it turns out the dealer was overwhelmed by angry people afterwards who came up and said, "You promised me that car. I was going to buy that car. You screwed me. That car is mine." I finally got a call from one of these people who wanted to buy it from me, and I would have made a profit, a significant profit, simply handing the car over after 48 hours. And I realized, no, the things that I saw about it were really one-of-a-kind things, and this was an unrepeatable experience. So let me go more into detail. Style and preserved condition. With the style, nearly all the cars built in 1913 were usually a foot or more higher than this. They were higher because in the early days people were used to horse carriages, and you needed to be high enough to see over the horse, and there was no particular reason to be low, and therefore it made sense to sit up in the sky. It was only after they started going faster that a low center of gravity started to appeal to them. But the idea of a low car being the sporty look only gradually came in. There were also practical considerations. In the early years, the roads were not paved. When it rained, and in the spring and fall, you had long periods where the roads were nothing more than mud tracks. And if you see some of these old pictures, the mud was deep, like 6 or 8 inches deep. And that's why you have great big wheels like this to go into the wheel tracks and not get stuck. This was actually a disadvantage for this car because it was an underslung. And that meant that it had less ground clearance than nearly all the other cars on the road. There was underslung by a company called just American, so it was the American underslung. It had even bigger wheels than this, racy but somewhat awkward proportions. This is the only one that really, in my opinion, got it right. With most cars, you have the frame and the axle underneath and springs supporting the axle. So the axle comes up, but you have to have clearance between the axle and the frame to allow for suspension movement. With an underslung, the situation is reversed, so that you have the frame as the lowest thing, and the axle is above the frame, as is the spring. So you see how here is the frame, and here is the spring, and there's the axle. So the axle is relatively high up, and that allows the car to be built really low. It was lower than nearly all the other cars of its time. It had a combination of racy elements that defined the high-performance sports car for 30 or 40 years afterwards. This is a 1913 car. Just 3 or 4 years before that, you would never get something as low as this, and you would never get the combination of features that this has. A low, wide look in front, exaggerated somewhat because this was a southern car, and the southern cars had a wider track by several inches than the standard car. So it's lower and wider than the usual car. Enormous headlights gave a dramatic sort of face to the front of the car. The hood appeared on American cars in about 1903, and it was always a sort of shorthand for the engine place and the power, and therefore a big long hood meant a big powerful engine. So we have a long hood here, long front fenders reaching way forward. The radiator set back so that it's either above or behind, in this case behind the front axle. The steering column, the lower the car, the flatter the angle of the steering column, and therefore the racier it is. One of the special advantages of this car is exactly the year that it was made, 1913. 1913 was the first year for a couple of the features that you'll see on this car. One of them is that it has a cowl and side doors. On the previous year's model, it had neither of those, so that it was just an empty space there. That was the typical raceabout look of this time, but having the front doors and the cowl means that we've got this graceful flowing line going straight back there. In 1913 also, it was the first year of electric lighting. The previous style of lights were brass rectangular lumps. You shine up the brass and they're sparkling and so forth, but they're not the streamlined look that this has. the overall proportions of the thing, I think, are just spectacular. Long hood, driver set well back, long front fenders, big prominent wheels. The combination, I think, is just, it couldn't be improved on. The original top, after 111 years, is not in great shape to serve as a top, but the wonderful thing about it is that it is the original top. So you see exactly what the fittings and the style of it is and so forth. What we're going to do now is just show you how the top goes up. First, we take the straps off that hold it down. The next thing is we raise the top up. Then we remount the intermediate pieces like this, and we bring it forward. And if you can do yours first, we'll see how the front part attaches. Windshields were optional in 1913. You could have a windshield, but it was this awkward thing. They were designed with no attention to aesthetics, and therefore were very ugly. And you weren't going, well, you were going fast enough to get pretty wet if it was raining significantly, but the top would at least do for a start, like this without the windshield. It makes it considerably less racy, but it's wonderful to have the true original top and all of its fittings just as it was originally. Aside from the look and the feel of something 111 years old, one advantage is that I'm not worried about putting a scratch on it. I'm not worried about getting a little grease and dirt on things, and it is much easier to work on than a lot of newer cars. I haven't done very much work to this car, but it did need a few things to get working right. I had a mysterious problem that it would start fine, and once it warmed up, it would just lose power to the point where it didn't have any power. And I finally diagnosed this after taking part of the engine apart. If you come in here, you'll see what I did. The problem I realized was that the valves were cracked. It had the original valves that were not broken, but just cracked. And once they warmed up, the crack opened up and it didn't have any compression anymore. Pieces are deep inside the engine, and with a modern engine, it would be a big trouble to get to it. But in this period, the idea was that it needed to be accessible for anybody without any particular training to be able to get at things. So, for example, to get the valves out, the first thing you do is you take the side plate off the engine. This is a plate, the two wing nuts here. You take the two wing nuts off, you take the plate off, and you see the valves right in front of you. They come out through the top. So the valves are directly underneath these plugs. So to take this valve out, I would, of course, take the spark plug out. I would undo this plug. I would squeeze down the valve spring and release the keeper, and I simply push the valve out the top. Once you've learned the routine on this, taking the valves out is 20 minutes, half an hour. You get them out, you take a look at them. If you need to replace them, you replace them, and so forth. It's a wonderfully accessible engine. In 1912, Cadillac introduced in the main market an electric self-starter. Before that time, cars had to be crank-started. There's a whole lot of sort of anxiety tied up with that, and it in fact is pretty hard work to crank an old car if the engine is old and it's reluctant to start. The most critical thing in crank starting is the timing. When an engine is running, the spark plug fires thousands of times a minute, and as the engine runs, the spark takes a little while to light up the mixture in the cylinders. What that means is that the spark plug fires before the piston gets to the top of its stroke. At the speeds that an engine runs when you're driving it, this means that the spark fires, the piston comes to full top. When it's at the full top, the pressure gets to be full and it runs efficiently. The problem is that if you're crank starting it, it's not running that fast, and if the spark fires before the mixture gets to the top, it will fire backwards and the crank will come around and hit your arm. So early cars had a spark adjustment, convenient on the steering wheel. Here is the spark adjustment, that's the throttle. What I'm doing is I'm moving the spark adjustment so that it is not advanced anymore. Then I will turn on the ignition and then come around to the front of the car. The approved thing is not to hold your thumb around the crank, but just hold it with your hand like this. There's now it's crank start. When the timing is moved to advance, if you listen carefully, it will speed up slightly and it will smooth out. Having the spark advance is better when you're running, but it has to be retarded in order not to have it kick back and possibly injure you when you're starting it. Crank starting is all very well, but it didn't have an electric starter when it was new, but it's a big heavy engine and I got pretty tired of cranking it, so I installed an electric starter on mine as tactfully as possible in order to disturb the originality as little as possible. So from the view that you have here, it's almost impossible to see the starter, which is deep under the flywheel there. Speedometers were an aftermarket accessory on a lot of early cars, and this one, being a somewhat deluxe car, had a speedometer. The speedometer is driven from a gear off of the front wheel. You see the gear here, and the cable is attached to that small gear that goes around the back of it. Because it's been sitting for 111 years or 100 years since it last drove its speedometer, I have not used the speedometer. I need to make sure that the cable is free and so forth, but it's all here and all period correct. This one has some familiar ones and some that are not so familiar. The clutch is on the left, the brake is on the right. Both of them work more or less like the modern equivalent. It's got a 3-speed gearbox with a conventional H pattern that works more or less as usual. The handbrake is sitting on the right. All of that is fairly conventional. The main difference is that in the early years, the idea of using the accelerator as your main control gradually occurred to people but was not the standard thing. The most common car in the first many years of American car history was the Model T Ford. And the Model T Ford, it had all sorts of different gearbox situations that I won't go into, but it didn't even have an accelerator. You just used the throttle as you would on a tractor today. With this car, it has the throttle on the steering wheel here. This is the throttle, and it also has an accelerator. But look at the accelerator. It's this tiny little thing that you have to point your toe to get at, that's between the brake and the clutch. The reason it's called the accelerator is that it was only really used for accelerating. It wasn't used as the main control of speed as you went along. The trouble is that for some driving situations, it's very nice to have a handy accelerator. In particular, the ease of shifting with a manual gearbox was changed enormously in about 1930 when the synchromesh was developed. Before that, the gears just crunched into each other, and having them crunch into each other less can be done by double clutching, which means that when you're shifting down in particular, you let the clutch out when you're in neutral, rev the engine up to speed up the countershaft on the gearbox, and pull it in just so to match the speed of those gears. That's something that can't be done with a throttle, but can be done with an accelerator. So it's kind of nice to be able to get at the accelerator. Familiar on British cars where they drive on the left, but in the US we've always driven on the right. If you're driving on the right, why do you have right-hand drive? In fact, probably the majority of American cars built up to this time, 1913, were right-hand drive. The Model T in 1908 broke that pattern, and gradually people moved to the left. It's sort of a trade-off. If you're on the right, you have a better view of whether you're about to fall off into the ditch on the right. If you have it on the left, you can see more clearly in passing situations. I think falling into a ditch was more common than passing situations back then, so having the steering wheel on the right made sense.